the volume of the problem. So if you can't hear me, try to figure out some way to let me know, and I'll see what I can do about it. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jeremy Woodoff. I'm a member of the board of directors, and we welcome you to this lecture sponsored by the Metropolitan Chapter of the Victorian Society in America. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, I have a couple of announcements. Chapter members should have received membership renewal notices. If you're not up to date on membership dues, please follow the link in the email or go to our website, www.vicsocny.org, that's vicsocny.org, to renew. If you're attending tonight's lecture but are not yet a member, the website will describe the benefits of membership. The website's calendar includes a notification of the March 14th deadline for proposals for our Emerging Scholars event to be held on May 16th. If you or someone you know is a student or a recent graduate, please consider submitting a proposal for a presentation on current research on 19th and early 20th century culture. We have no known limits on topics, which can include architecture, literature, theater, fine and decorative art, immigration, economics, politics, education, gender roles, reform movements, fashion, and food. Also, the February 14th deadline is approaching for our Margot Gale grant applications. Funds are awarded to projects related to the preservation, conservation, and/or interpretation of material culture in the New York metropolitan area from circa 1837 to 1919. See the website for more details. Also, follow the calendar on the website for upcoming lectures. And now, get your 3D glasses ready for today's lecture, Building the Brooklyn Bridge, 1869 to 1883. Our speaker, Jeffrey I. Richman, has been fascinated by New York City's history for as long as he can remember. In 2007, after 33 years practicing law, representing indigent criminal defendants, he became the full-time historian at Brooklyn's Greenwood Cemetery. Since then, he has led Greenwood's Civil War, World War I, and World War II projects, which, with the help of hundreds of volunteers, have researched, written, and posted online biographies of thousands of veterans interred there. He's the author of 3 books, including Brooklyn's Greenwood Cemetery, New York's Buried Treasure, published in 1998. He has also curated many exhibitions, including 3 on the Civil War and 1 on Coney Island. Driven by his passion for history in general and 19th century New York in particular, Jeff is an avid collector who has amassed an outstanding collection of stereo view and lantern slide photographs of early New York, including many of the Brooklyn Bridge under construction that he has donated to the Greenwood Historic Fund, and you'll see some of those tonight. One of his fondest memories is of attending the 100th anniversary of the bridge's opening in 1983. And I can say I share that memory as I was there that same night, just one milestone in his love affair with the Brooklyn Bridge. If you requested 3D glasses and they haven't arrived, remember that this talk will be recorded and available online in the future, so hold on to the glasses when they come. If you didn't already request them, we can still send them to you. Request a pair by putting your name and mailing address in the chat or responding to the email that is being sent out. Speaking of the chat, if you have a question or comment, please type in the chat when you think of it so that we can get right into the Q&A when the talk is finished. Now, Jeff, please begin.
Well, thank you, Jeremy, and thank you to the Victorian Society for allowing me to do this presentation. I'm going to be talking about my book, which was just published in September, Building the Brooklyn Bridge, 1869 to 1883. And let me go right to sharing the screen here. And Zoom willing, I think we're good here. So here we are, Building the Brooklyn Bridge, the title of the book and my name. And the cover of the book showing a view from Brooklyn towards Manhattan, the footbridge, which we will discuss, some of the anchor bars, the carrier wheel, and the process of spinning the cables. And so let's first of all get oriented. Here we are, a print available online from the Library of Congress showing the New Jersey shore, showing Manhattan with Broadway going up the spine of Manhattan, and then showing Brooklyn over here. Brooklyn, what is now, was then City Hall, now Borough Hall. And then in the distance at top right, you see green, which means that we're seeing the relatively empty areas of Brooklyn. And so 1869, it was largely believed that Manhattan was as full as it was ever going to be. There was no concept in 1869 when the bridge was started to be built of going up. And so you needed land for people to live on and to have their homes. And Brooklyn was very attractive in that regard. Brooklyn was the third largest city in the United States in 1869, the largest being New York City and essentially Manhattan. And the bridge opened in 1883, May 24th of 1883. Here is a token from just 6 years later for the centennial of George Washington's inauguration. And so Washington is on the other side, but on this side, we see the New York and Brooklyn Bridge described as the eighth wonder of the world. And so it had quickly caught on in the Victorian age. It was this marvel of cutting edge technology and construction techniques. People quickly wanted to be associated with the bridge. And so here is a spool cotton company that put their spools up into the cables of the bridge and up at the top of the towers. And there were all sorts of companies that wanted to associate themselves with the success of the Brooklyn Bridge. The masterwork, of course, is David McCullough's The Great Bridge, which was published in 1972 and is a great resource. The three key parties in this story are John A. Roebling, the father, German immigrant, his son, Washington Roebling, who at the age of 32 took over as the chief engineer of the Brooklyn Bridge, and Washington Roebling's wife, Emily Roebling. And so again, the book is constructed along these lines. I have an introduction from Richard Haw, who wrote the biography of John Roebling. And in an introduction, The Brooklyn Bridge, A Love Story by Erica Wagner, who wrote the biography of Washington Roebling. And so I was very proud to be able to get them to write those pieces, and then broke the book down essentially in terms of a broad view of the engineers, the chief engineers and the assistant engineers, the workers, and then the various stages of construction that you see described here, all the way through the opening day of the bridge. And so we will now track those chapters. So here we are with the engineers, the two chief engineers, John Roebling again, and Washington Roebling. And here they are pictured in an illustration of the time. John A. Roebling was the chief engineer. He was the most successful and best known of the suspension bridge builders in America in the 19th century. He had trained in Germany as an engineer. He had studied philosophy with Hegel, who by one account described John Roebling as his favorite student. But John Roebling decided after his family had lived in Mulhausen, Saxony, Germany for generations, that Germany was no longer for him, that America was the land of opportunity. And so he fled Germany with a group of others and declared himself a Pennsylvania farmer. He and his brother purchased thousands of acres in Western Pennsylvania, not far from Pittsburgh. And he farmed for about a year and then decided that it was not sufficiently stimulating for him and abandoned farming, never ever farmed before he arrived in Pennsylvania, and became a surveyor, and then had written a publication from Europe about wire rope and became a wire rope manufacturer in this tiny little town in Western Pennsylvania. And from wire rope, he got involved as a suspension bridge builder. As you can see, he was known for his fierce eyes, which you see here, not much of a sense of humor by all accounts, but a man was considered a great genius in terms of the engineering challenges of suspension bridges. And so the family business was John A. Roebling's Sons, primarily based in Trenton, New Jersey. After it left Pennsylvania, they became the largest manufacturers of wire rope in the world. And so the cables of the Manhattan Bridge and the Williamsburg Bridge and the George Washington Bridge and even the Golden Gate Bridge are Roebling wire. But oddly enough, the cables of the Brooklyn Bridge are not Roebling wire. Here is Washington Roebling, dressed in the uniform of a Union soldier during the Civil War. He had attended Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. If you wanted to study civil engineering or military engineering, you could do so at two places in America when he attended school. One was West Point, and the other was RPI up in Troy, New York. He would spend his summers working with his father on bridge building. And so by the time of the work on the Brooklyn Bridge beginning in 1869, he was tremendously experienced as a bridge builder. He had served in the Civil War. Early in the Civil War, at dinner, his father had said that Washington had spent enough time camping at his home, and it was time to go and fight for the Union. And so he enlisted as a private and worked his way up through the ranks, ultimately leaving as a brevet lieutenant colonel. He was also something of a Zelig character during the Civil War, turning up at the most crucial moments of the war, including at Gettysburg on Little Round Top. He was very much the chief engineer in waiting. His father wrote about wanting to turn the bridge construction, the Brooklyn Bridge construction, over to Washington. And at the age of 32, when his father died, and more on that shortly, Washington Roebling took over the construction of the bridge. Emily Roebling was not trained as an engineer, but she played a pivotal role in the construction of the bridge. She went to Europe with Washington, her husband, in 1867 to study caissons, and they would be the foundations for the towers of the Brooklyn Bridge. Had not been used in the United States up until the Brooklyn Bridge. And when Washington Roebling became ill and debilitated and a self-described invalid, she became the liaison to the assistant engineers and the contractors. And so he, strangely enough, during the entire years of the construction from 1869 to 1883, Washington Roebling never set foot on the Brooklyn Bridge. But it was Emily Roebling who went out 2 or 3 times a day to the assistant engineers to explain to them what had to be done. She was tremendously admired by the staff. At her husband's insistence, she led the first delegation of trustees to walk across the bridge as the bridge was being built. And she was also the first one to ride across the bridge in triumph, holding a rooster as a symbol of the triumph of the construction of the bridge. So crossing the East River, why a bridge on the East River, which of course is a tidal estuary, not so much a river. Here is a print from 1750 showing Brooklyn in the foreground and Manhattan in the distance and the East River between them. And there were ferries running in the 18th century across at this point. They were powered even before Fulton's steam engine was invented. They were powered by horsepower who walked on treadmills. And one of the problems with the East River was that it, in the 19th century, froze during winter periodically. And so the ferries that were transporting people who might live in Brooklyn and work in Manhattan, or vice versa, could not get through. And also, as you see in this newspaper article, people were imperiled who started to walk across to get to work. And then the ice might break apart and leave them stranded. And so the East River was, in fact, a barrier. And the solution was a suspension bridge. So here we are, Scientific American, 1879, showing illustrations of the 4 great suspension bridges of the United States. And so the first one, the second one, the third one, and the fourth one are all Roebling bridges. There were other bridge builders in the United States, but they were not, either were not building suspension bridges or they were not building them successfully. And so one of his rivals, in fact, built a bridge in Wheeling, West Virginia, and that bridge collapsed. It was not unusual for bridges to be collapsing in Europe, suspension bridges that had been built. John Roebling built a total of 10 bridges. None of those bridges ever collapsed. And so here we are, the Niagara Bridge, one of their first great constructions of the Roeblings. Both John Roebling designed this and Washington Roebling worked on it. Constructed between 1851 and 1855, and across the Niagara Gorge, which one can easily imagine how difficult it was otherwise to get across reliably. And you see that this was, in fact, a 2-tiered bridge. So there are 4 cables here. 1, 2, 3, 4 holding up this bridge on stone piers. You see the truss element, which was a key Roebling quality to give a stiffness to the bridge so that it would not start to vibrate with wind or with any kind of rhythmic movement. And then there was a second tier, a second level underneath for carriages. So the top tier was for steam locomotives to pull railroads, railways across. And so here we're getting close to our 3D images. This is a stereoscopic view, which were tremendously popular during the Victorian era, starting in the late 1850s and really running into about 1920 was the period for these views. They were slightly different side-by-side photographs on a heavy card, paper card that was about 3.5 inches by about 7 inches. And the Victorians could travel the world with these views and see with a special dedicated viewer with 2 lenses, Paris in 3D or Egypt in 3D or London, just going around the world. And so this was very much the home entertainment center for the Victorian parlor. This shows you the side-by-side images. And then here is an anaglyph, which is a scan that with software that is available for free on the internet is turned into an image which when viewed with 3D glasses. And so now if you do have the 3D glasses, you want to put them on the way they are bent with the red lens on the left over your left eye and the cyan lens to your right. And then kind of adjust, I would say get about 16, 18 inches away and move your head a little bit, your eyes, and you should be able to see in 3D the Niagara Bridge. And so we have about 15 images in 3D that we will go through, most of which are of the Brooklyn Bridge. And I'd like to thank Jeremy for conscientiously getting these glasses out to all of you. Here is another 3D view, so glasses on for that. Of the bridge looking towards the Falls of Niagara in the distance, you see the American Falls here and the Canadian Falls here, and you get a good view of the carriage crossing underneath that top area where the railway went across. So this was actually the first bridge in the world that allowed railways to go across like this. So here we are, a subsequent bridge by the Roeblings, Allegheny Bridge in Pittsburgh, 1857 to 59. And then the Cincinnati Covington Bridge, 1856 to 1866, construction shut down during the Civil War. But for many people, this is kind of a mini view of the Brooklyn Bridge. And you see some of the fundamental aspects that would appear later in the Brooklyn Bridge. But this is a substantially reduced version of the Brooklyn Bridge. Curry and Ives print of the Brooklyn Bridge, which gives us a good opportunity to describe to you exactly what a suspension bridge is. And so what you're doing first is you need to keep the traffic on the East River going, the ship traffic, particularly because, of course, the Brooklyn Navy Yard is to the north of the bridge, and ships from the United States Navy had to get underneath this bridge. And so the towers serve that function by lifting up the deck of the bridge to allow passage underneath. Then you have cables. In the circumstance of the Brooklyn Bridge, 4 cables, 1, 2, 3, 4, which will be supporting the deck and the weight of carriages or cars or bicycles, depending on the era that you are in. And so from the cables hang these vertical suspenders up and down, and then they are attached to the steel beams of the Brooklyn Bridge. The Brooklyn Bridge was the first bridge in America, or well, first bridge to use steel as opposed to iron in its construction. And John Roebling very much believed that steel was the material of the future. And in fact, we know that steel cage buildings made possible Manhattan rising late in the 19th and early in the 20th century. You also had these diagonal stays that come off the tower, and you see them at an angle here. And they were important to reinforce, to strengthen the bridge. And so they ran from the top of the tower down at an angle to the beams. So here we are, as early as 1857, John Roebling had submitted plans. He and his son had been stuck on one of those ferries with the ice flows in the East River. John Roebling was not a patient man, and so he very much wanted to get something across the East River to allow for crossing. This was a plan that was to go up around Roosevelt Island, up around the 59th Street Bridge that stands today. And here we are. This is the ferry slip On the Brooklyn side at Fulton Street, you see the mansarded roofed terminal that actually opened during the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. And at the far left, you see the tower on the Brooklyn side, and then you see these ferry slips. And this is in fact where John Roebling, the father, was mortally wounded, as in June of 1869, he and his son were down there surveying for the center line of the bridge. And so this is the Hamilton Avenue ferry I photographed, which shows you what these pilings looked like at the side of the ferry slips. And so John Roebling was up in these kind of this area of the Fulton Ferry landing, and a ferry was coming in. And so he stood to the side, or at least he thought he stood far enough to the side, and rather his leg was crushed between the ferry and these wooden pilings, and he died a very, very painful death of lockjaw just several weeks later. And so he believed in hydrotherapy. He treated his wound with water, and that did not work. So the ferry really, ironically, killed off the man who had planned to build this bridge that would eventually kill off the ferries. This is his grave in Trenton, New Jersey. And here is his son, Washington. As I mentioned, he did not set foot on the Brooklyn Bridge during its construction. He had gotten the bends early in construction in one of the caissons, and he had also exhausted himself just putting so much work into making sure that the Brooklyn Bridge would be a huge success. And so this is showing him on Columbia Heights in Brooklyn Heights with binoculars. In fact, he used a telescope, and he would monitor the construction. And then Emily would go out and convey whatever messages were necessary and explanations to the workers. So here we are, so some wonderful photographs. This book kind of presented itself to me. Jeremy mentioned that I have been a collector pretty much all of my life. I've been collecting stereo views of New York City for about 40 years. And so I came across two other collectors who agreed to allow me to use their collections of Brooklyn Bridge images, and then Museum of the City of New York, Municipal Archives, and RPI Archives all contributed to this, as did Richard Hawes' collection of woodcuts. And so that altogether made it impossible for me to not write this book. And so here's a wonderful photograph of the staff in 1872 on the Brooklyn Tower. And what's great about this is that this is all keyed. So, you know, it's difficult when you have a photograph and no one is identified. And here, all of these individuals are identified. And so starting with the master mechanic is number 1, William Kingsley, the superintendent is number 2, et cetera, et cetera. Here's another view from 1878 of the construction of the bridge with the trustees here, with the draftsmen and supervisors here, some of the assistant engineers here also, and 2 of the assistant engineers in the foreground here, both of whom are interred at Greenwood Cemetery, where I'm the historian. This is William Payne at the left here, and this is George McNulty at the right. 6 assistant engineers, one of whom was hired on a 30-day contract early in the construction, all of whom worked the entire 14 years, stayed until the bridge opened. Really quite remarkable. So here's the gravestone for Colonel Payne, who had served during the Civil War with Washington Roebling. And here's a gravestone that I had made for George McNulty as part of our unmarked grave project. His grave was not marked at Greenwood, and so we salvaged the stone from a stone yard that we purchased, the cemetery. And you see Brooklyn Bridge assistant engineer. He so admired Washington Roebling that he named his son Washington McNulty. And so the workers, here is a really remarkable photograph of the workers gathered for this photographer, and a detail of that. And so you can actually see the faces of the men who built the bridge. Several thousand worked on the bridge. At any given time in a week, 100, particularly when the caissons were being used, were quitting out of about 300 who were working. And so there was a tremendous turnover, but never a shortage of men who wanted to work on the bridge, primarily German, Italian, Irish immigrants, also veterans of the Civil War, just 4 years after the war had ended, and also a number of sailors who felt comfortable at heights. And so again, the faces of these men. And here we are with a half stereo view. So this is just half of the two images, or one of the two images. And you see this photographer really understood what was important to get a maximum 3D effect, to have barrels in the foreground, to have men in the midground, and then the tower in the distance. And so here we are with the 3D image. If you put your glasses back on, you should be able to see this one pretty well. And those barrels should pop pretty well also in terms of their 3D quality. Again, a half stereo view of men building brick vaults that would be part of the approach. And then with glasses on, seeing these men and their scaffolding in 3D. So here we are, the caissons, which I've mentioned a couple of times. Now I'll explain to you exactly what the caissons were. The Europeans had pioneered the use of caissons for mines and for things that had to be dug down into the ground. And so the idea was that you were going to create this massive wooden box that was open at its bottom. You were going to pump compressed air into it to keep the waters of the East River out of the working space. And you were going to allow men to climb down into this box to work and to dig this box down into the ground, upon which the blocks, the granite and limestone blocks that would make up the towers of the Brooklyn Bridge would be piled. And so this thing was massive, as I think you can see from the size of the men atop it. It was 168 feet long by 102 feet wide. David McCullough calculated you could fit 4 tennis courts on the top of these caissons. So there were 2 caissons, one for the foundation of the Brooklyn Tower and one for the New York Tower. And so, of course, if you were going to dig these huge boxes into the ground, and they became the largest things that had ever been dug into the ground in the history of humankind up until then you needed to see or get some idea of what you were going to encounter. And so here we are in 1867, they're taking borings to figure out what kind of stratification they're going to encounter. Here's a drawing from the municipal archives. And here is a detail of that drawing showing the boring area at left, and then showing some of what they were going to be encountering as they went down, a layer of sand with much clay, sand and gravel, et cetera, et cetera. So this is launching of a caisson. The caissons were built at the Webb and Bell shipyard in Greenpoint, the Brooklyn caisson, and then Webb and Bell moved to Manhattan, East 6th Street, and that's where the Manhattan caisson was built. And so it was built as a ship. Webb and Bell had built some of the largest ships on the seas, and they built this out of timber, 12 by 12-inch sticks, as they called them. And they would then slide it down the ways, launch it the same way they would launch a ship. Other engineers told Washington Roebling that this thing was going to go right to the bottom of the East River as soon as it was launched. You can see it here as it would be proceeding down, and then it would level itself, and it exactly went as he had planned. So here, Eckford Webb, shipbuilder, really extraordinary granite carving of a ship under construction. And then on the back, this is at Greenwood Cemetery, Eckford Webb, 1825 to 1893, and an eminent shipbuilder and constructor of the caissons for the first Brooklyn Suspension Bridge. And so this is a man, as I said, who built some of the largest ships on the sea, and his proudest accomplishment was one of the caissons of the Brooklyn Bridge. So this is a caisson, how it operated. This is a woodcut drawing that would have been in one of the illustrated newspapers. I think this one was in Harper's Weekly. Of course, there was Frank Leslie and others. And what you're seeing here is the digging space where the men worked, removing boulders and sand and clay and mud. There were 2 scoops, and these scoops came down through what was essentially a barometer that was holding the compressed air inside the chamber, but these scoops could come down through the water, scoop up the debris from a pool down below, and pull it up and out of the caisson. And then these are the entryways for the men. There was an airlock up in here, and then a supply shaft, and also a air shaft for the compressed air. So you see how they're piling. Here's the wood of the caisson, and here are the stones that would make up the tower, and they are piling these blocks one at a time, helping to stabilize the caisson, and at the same time to hopefully drive it down a bit into the ground. So they were going to dig on the Brooklyn side about 50 feet, and on the New York side about 80 or 90 feet down with these huge wooden boxes, which are still there, I might add. So here's an early drawing by John Roebling, I believe, of what this was going to look like, again with the caisson below, the wood of the caisson, and then the stone of the tower rising up above. And here's a more sophisticated drawing, a more complex drawing by Washington Roebling with the various shafts. And you see below the water pool where they would dump the debris and then pull it out with those clamshell buckets. The foundation of the New York Tower, 1872. So we can usually tell the Manhattan side versus the Brooklyn side because the Brooklyn side was the first and was more advanced as the tower than the Manhattan side. And so here you see the Brooklyn Tower beginning to rise up above, where the Manhattan Tower in the foreground has not yet reached that height. You also see snow here, so we know this is winter. And you see this building here, and you see some sort of notation here. And if we look more closely, it says air compressor house. So these were the engines that compress the air to then be pumped into the caisson to keep the water of the East River at bay. You also see it says winter here, which we've confirmed from the snow. Erica Wagner, who, as I mentioned, wrote the biography of Washington Roebling as an expert on all things Washington Roebling. She assures me that this handwriting is by Washington. So here we are in airlock with a woodcut in 1869 through 1883 until about 1890, I think it was. Mass-produced newspapers could not mass-produce photographs. And so they had a process of morphing photographs or drawings into woodcuts carved into wooden blocks to reproduce them. Here we are breaking up the boulders in the caissons. This was tremendously labor intensive until Washington Roebling came up with the idea of using black powder to blast these apart. He went down into the caisson with a revolver and used increasingly large charges to see if they had any effect on the caisson, on the men, on the working conditions, decided that they did not, and therefore they started blasting these apart so that they could be pulled out. And here are the men moving debris from one section of the caisson to another. Here they are at the water shaft at the bottom of the water shaft, mixing one of the pools. They soon discovered that the material, the debris that they put into these water shafts quickly hardened, and the scoops could not get it up. And so they had to assign men to mix it. And you see also at lower left a hose, which kept the amount of water there at a appropriate level. So here we are, John Roebling dredgers that he had drawn, and then the actual dredgers. So this is certainly an example of the plan that John Roebling came up, and then the actuality that Washington Roebling had to tweak. And so here we see, trying to find my cursor. Oops. I was afraid that would happen. You see the two clamshell buckets, one pretty much in the middle of the photograph and one at the far left of the photograph. And above the one in the middle of the photograph with that frame holding it up, you see a man sitting on a board. And I did consult with an engineer expert in historic bridge construction. And he explained to me that that man is sitting there to signal to the steam engine operator who is controlling the height of the clamshell bucket when he has reached the pool and should stop lowering the bucket. So very much typical of what was going on, that they're both cutting edge technology of the Victorian age and very primitive techniques also at the same time. Oops. So here's a better look at the clamshell bucket, and you can see they were dropping debris into cars. They were then rolling the cars to the edge of the caisson and dumping it into the East River, and then dredging it out of the river as necessary. Okay, now we're in the towers. These are what are going to hold the bridge up, the bridge deck, 135 feet above the water. And so again, we can see in this wonderful photograph, we're on the New York side and the Brooklyn Tower is rising in the distance. One of John Roebling's drawings of the tower, he was very much influenced clearly by his experience having grown up in Mulhausen, which was surrounded by a stone wall, as was typical in Germany. And so he wanted this stone grand arched entrance to Brooklyn and to New York. This was really never repeated again after this. A reduced version of this had been done across the Ohio River in Cincinnati. And here is a detail with a kind of interesting little drawing here of a woman with a parasol, apparently as just a detail that the draftsman could not resist. So here we are, a drawing by Washington Roebling of one of the towers. Each of these stones was custom cut. But you see here also something that's important to understand, which is that the towers are hollow. And so this is a hollow area, this is a hollow area, hollow. Based on his calculations, it was not necessary to put stone in there, and you could save on construction costs by not putting stone there. So here we are, the tower rising. We're on the New York side again, because you can see the Brooklyn Tower in the distance. A wonderful photograph with these stones hanging here. I think this photographer had very much of an in with the bridge company. Here's the Manhattan Tower, and it gives you a sense of its scale relative to the 4- and 5-story buildings that lined South Street in Manhattan. And so the seaport would be over here. This is St. Paul's Chapel here, the old post office, which opened in 1876. Whoops. And the New York Tribune building, which was slightly higher. It's difficult to tell at this angle, but slightly higher than the bridge towers. And so here again, we have some wonderful photographs of the bridge in 3D. If you put your glasses on, you should be able to see this sailing ship coming across with Manhattan behind it. And then another view of the bridge. Let me just go back. We jumped ahead. One of the towers going up also in 3D with your glasses. And then a third beautifully composed photograph with the Brooklyn Tower at the left and the Manhattan Tower in the distance. And we can even make out here the shot tower built by James Bogardus, who is buried at Greenwood Cemetery. And a quick plug for the Victorian Society. The Victorian Society gave us a Margot Gale grant several years ago, and we put out bronze plaques for Bogardus, who was the pioneer of cast iron architecture, and for Daniel Badger, who ran the architectural ironworks. So here we are looking down from the Brooklyn Tower. You get a sense of how low the Brooklyn quote unquote skyline was. And then the anchorages. So these were for your cables. You needed to connect the ends of the cables and tie them down. And so they built these massive granite pieces on both sides of the bridge. This shows you the technology that they used. They had a anchor plate at the bottom to which they attached anchor chains. And then the anchor chain got attached to the cables. And this was all surrounded by stone to keep it in place. And so Washington Roebling was asked whether he intended, as the Europeans had done, to make these accessible for maintenance. And he said, no, Americans are an impatient people and they will not want to come and maintain it. So we're just going to surround it with stone and call it a day. And so that's what they did here. This gives you a perspective. Here is the anchorage on the Manhattan side and the Manhattan Tower. And the cables are going to hang down this way and then go into the anchorage where they will be tied down. So here are anchor plates, these large kind of starfished cast iron. And then this again is in 3D. So with glasses on, you should be able to see the 3D effect on that. And then we go to the bars of the anchor chain, and then in 3D with your glasses on. And now we go to the footbridge and cradles. So the footbridge, the idea of the footbridge was to build this temporary construction of oak slats that would allow the men to get out on these cradles, to reach these cradles, and to monitor the cables as they were being spun. And so the technique is, in France, they were building cables and then lifting them up onto the towers. And that was a problem because the tension on the wires was uneven and was not good engineering wise. And so what they did here was they created the cables in place one wire at a time by pulling them across. And so you see those cradles here between the towers. And this is, to my mind, the best of the 3D images. So if you get your glasses on, and if you rock back and forth from side to side, you can see these wooden supports moving with you. You can see the wood in the foreground moving with you, and you're looking down towards the footbridge. So here we are, a woodcut of one of the workers monitoring the cable. This is the cable, the wires, the parallel wires of the cable as they're being spun. And he's got a flag in his right hand, and he's supposed to signal if one of the wires is not taut enough or too taut. Here we are, come one, come all. And so there's a sign there, but what you don't see at this entrance to the footbridge is a gate or a security guard or anything else. And so you could climb up a stairway to get up onto the anchorage, and then you could walk across the footbridge on your own. And so here we are in 3D. This is the image that we used on the cover of the book. And I think you get a wonderful 3D effect on this with the anchor bars in the foreground and the tower, and the men there are probably trustees of the bridge. And another 3D image of two of the workers, and we're looking down from the tower towards the shed. So that was on the Brooklyn side. That's where they kept the wire that was going to be spun. Here we are, another 3D image looking up the footbridge. These slats were spaced to allow the wind to get through them, so the gyration of the footbridge would be somewhat limited. And here we have regrets. I've had a few, to quote Sinatra, people wanted to go out on the footbridge and climb across, and some regretted their decision when they got 200 feet up above the water. And one of the veteran workers remarked that the women who went across seemed to actually do better than the men. So here we are, the cables of the bridge. This is part of the wrapping procedure. And so first they had to create the cables. They ran a wire across, pulled it across by ship, and then pulled it up onto the top of the tower, created a loop. And that loop was then driven by a steam engine. And so this is E.F. Farrington, the master mechanic, demonstrating to his workers that it was safe to be up on the wires at this height. And this gives you an idea very similar to a clothesline. You would attach a wire to it and pull it across from the Brooklyn side to the New York side, and then do it again. Pulling with this carrier wheel, you see these two wires here that are looped around to be pulled across. They had to do a lot of wire splicing. And so this is just a wonderful, elegant woodcut of that technique. Here's the wire shed atop the Brooklyn anchorage. And looking down again. And there were two huge wheels of wire attached or dedicated to each of the four cables. So here we are, the connection between the anchor bars going down into the anchorage and the strands. So each cable had 19 strands, and each strand had 254 wires it was, and each of those wires was about the thickness of a lead pencil. Here's Washington Roebling playing around with the idea of how to arrange these. He had never built a bridge. I don't think a bridge had been built in America that had this many strands and wires. And so he was trying to figure out how you would array them. And as you can see, he is changing his mind up in here. 14 will become 16, etc. This is one of my favorite photographs of the bridge construction. This is from my own collection of lantern slides, which are very Victorian, also showing the 4 cables. So here is one cable that has been bracketed, the strands. Here is a second one bracketed. Here's a third one with the strands visible and not clamped down. And here's the 4th cable, also not clamped down. And so we're looking at Manhattan. City Hall would have been right around here. This is the top of the tower, showing both a cable here, which is parallel wires, and these twisted wires, which are the diagonal stays coming off the tower. And here's another great 3D image. So glasses on for that. And you see one of those brackets up in here that they're using. And here's one in use down here for the compression of the cables. Wrapping the cables in winter, they carried this on. They wrapped the cables with galvanized zinc wire. And so here you see they're going around this way, whereas these wires are parallel. These are the wires of the cable. This did a great deal to protect the wires. And so the original cables are still in place on the Brooklyn Bridge. Here we see the divisions of the bridge, 2 outside sections, and then a center section. A wonderful drawing by Assistant Engineer Wilhelm Hildenbrand of the approach from the Municipal Archives. Here again, glasses on, is a great image of the approach as it was under construction. And you should see a definite 3D effect on the boards in the foreground as opposed to the approach and the tower in the distance. So here we are at construction. They're building this wooden railway, temporary, to allow them to move materials around. You can just barely at the top here see one of the railroad cars. And here is a better look at it. And here is one of them in operation with a payload underneath it so that they could transport a stone over here or materials over there. Here we are, the suspended superstructure. So that's the deck of the bridge. You see the steel beams here, 85 feet across. John Roebling was thrilled to know that his bridge was going to be as wide as Broadway, 80 feet. And then it ultimately had to be expanded by Washington Roebling to 85 feet. And so here we see the suspenders hanging off the cables, supported by the cables attached to the beams, and they're laying these beams out. And so here you see a better look and a woodcut of the beams as they're attached to the suspenders. And these are the sections of the bridge. And so the bridge really pioneered the idea of an elevated pedestrian promenade, which I think was one of the most brilliant aspects of the bridge. And so you had that for pedestrians, then you had mass transit, you were going to have a railway, a cable railway across the bridge, and then you were going to have 2 lanes for carriages or for livestock that came across the bridge. And so here we get some sense of that in this woodcut. One of the problems with woodcuts, though, is that they tend to be fanciful at times. And so you're only seeing 1 lane here where there should be 2. Here are the railways and terminals. The railway didn't open up until September of 1883, about 4 months after the bridge itself opened. And the idea was to offer mass transit from Brooklyn to Manhattan. William Payne, as I mentioned, was one of the assistant engineers, and he was an expert on cable cars. He had worked in San Francisco, he would work in Denver and Cleveland on their cable cars. This is the steam engine in Brooklyn that drove the cable cars, 5 cents for a 5-minute ride from one end of the bridge to the other. These are the terminals here on the Brooklyn side, some of the wonderful detailing, municipal archives, and the Brooklyn terminal has almost finished. Here we are inside the terminal. So they had 3 tracks, 3 sets of tracks. And then we have a little bit of a video here, actually, a movie from 1899 with a cameraman at the front of one of the cable cars. And you see here, right in the middle between the 2 tracks where the cable is, you also see these cars here, which were added between the opening of the bridge in 1883 and this in 1899. And so they wanted more mass transit and did that. And then, of course, this is the latest development, September of last year, a bike lane on the bridge. So cars ascendant circa 1950, bicycles ascendant circa 2021. And for me, what's wonderful is that the pedestrian promenade has been restored to its original concept of pedestrians only, with the bike lanes being created down here. And so opening day, May 24th, 1883, a grand celebration in the cities of Brooklyn and Manhattan. Hundreds of thousands of people come into the city. Chester A. Arthur, President of the United States, a New Yorker, is there to celebrate. Seth Lowe, the mayor of Brooklyn, greets the president. This signalman is waving his flag to signal to the North American fleet to fire in salute. And a union of hearts, a union of hands. Here is the grand display that night. And of course, as I mentioned, as Jeremy mentioned, we were both there in 1983, 100 years later, for the fireworks by the Grucci family. And the bridge remains this icon of New York and America. When you want to publicize the Knicks versus the Nets, you do it with the Brooklyn Bridge behind them. And the bridge today in all its glory. And once more, my book, the cover, and some of the squibs on the back, of which I'm very proud, including the one by Kurt Anderson, which I will read very quickly because I think it's so beautifully written and I'm so proud of it. If you love Brooklyn or bridges or New York City or cities or 19th century marvels or all of the above, as I do, building the Brooklyn Bridge is a perfect feast, a would-be time traveler's delight, overflowing with rare and evocative image and fascinating images. It's a terrific book. And so just one more image here. A quotation from Montgomery Schuyler, who was a critic with Harper's Weekly. On the day the bridge opened, this appeared in Harper's Weekly. It so happens that the work, which is likely to be our most durable monument and to convey some knowledge of us to the most remote posterity, is a work of bare utility, not a shrine, not a fortress, not a palace, but a bridge. And so that concludes my presentation. I will stop my screen sharing. And if we do have any questions, I'd be happy to answer those.
Oh, Jeff, just let me say, I'm not going to take time to say how absolutely marvelous this is and how wonderful these illustrations are. I'm just sort of speechless over it. So thank you very much. But let's get right. Let's get right to the questions. It is getting late, but perhaps we can get through a few of them. So let's see. First one from Jane Barnes. The Black Rock Book Club has logged in after reading the novel The Engineer's Wife. While historical fiction, I found it to be quite accurate in some of the descriptions of the actual construction of the bridge. Do you know the book? And if so, would you agree or disagree?
I do not know that book, so I cannot neither agree nor disagree, but I will look, give me that title again.
The Engineer's Wife.
Okay, I will. And so I assume it's about Emily Roebling?
I would assume so.
Right, and so importantly, a section of the Brooklyn Bridge has been named for her just a few months ago. And I'm going to be doing an event in May where we're going to be in Emily Roebling Park with boards, anaglyphs, doing an illustrated talk about the Brooklyn Bridge and being able to point out above us the elements of the bridge.
Okay. Another question, what was the landscape at the base of the bridge when it was decided on location? Was there housing or open land, shipping? What was there that had to be relocated?
Right, there were buildings there. I do have a volume of the reports of the trustees, and they go on at length about each of the properties that they acquired, how much they paid for it, et cetera, et cetera. So particularly on the Brooklyn side, also on the Manhattan side, but on the Manhattan side along the river, it had been a garbage dump in New York's history. And so they started to dig down there thinking that they were in heaven because it was soft material. And quickly a number of the men were overcome from the stench of the garbage there. So that was no picnic for them. But by and large, as they went farther in, and even Brooklyn to the very edge, was established properties very similar to these skylines that we saw.
Okay, there's a link in the chat for purchasing the book, which you should look at. From Eve Kahn, have any images or documents surfaced since you finished the book? Anything to add to a second edition? And what's your next book?
Yes, I actually have started to make notes of material for a second edition. I have met a professor of engineering in New York City who is working on a book about the Roeblings and their bridges. And his analysis is well beyond anything I could come up with in terms of the engineering of the bridge, but it's been fascinating to listen to him. For instance, I asked him why, in fact, they put the towers of the bridge in the water and then had to deal with the compressed air. Why didn't they just put it on land? Which seemed to me as a layman to make sense. And he explained that if they had done that, then the approaches would have extended that much more into Brooklyn and Manhattan and would have eaten up all that valuable land that they otherwise would not if they put the towers in the East River. So there's always more to be learned, and I'm learning it. And so hopefully, if we do well, we will have a second edition and I'll be able to tweak a few things in the book.
Leslie Taylor asks why the angled wires? There are not any on any other suspension bridges.
They actually did use them. I was looking at the Niagara images and you do see the angled wire. So the Roeblings were very conscientious about making the bridge as strong as possible. Other bridge builders didn't understand that concept. And so the angled wires, those diagonal guy wires, were to reinforce and strengthen the bridge and make the suspended superstructure that much stronger. So that was key to the construction, and that gives the bridge that spider web effect that we so appreciate today.
Are there any replicas of the bridge which demonstrate its construction and engineering?
Actually, somebody who was a fan of some of my Zoom presentations that I did at Greenwood sent me a kit to put together. And so you can do that and get some sense of the bridge. I think they're widely available in gift shops, etc., that you can find. And it's a nice project to work on.
John Graham says, in a few of the photos, it looked like Black Americans were among the workmen. Is that correct?
I don't think so. Most of the photographs, I think, are pretty much exclusively white workers. I did, late in my work on the book, find an image of a man of color at the bridge site. It is impossible to determine whether he was a passerby or was a worker there, but it is reproduced. I do have a section of the book which discusses the photographers who contributed so much to our knowledge of the bridge, and it is in that section that that photograph appears.
Okay. Someone asks when that is. I assume that means your talk in Emily Roebling Plaza.
Oh, right. I believe it's May 14th with a rain date of May 15th, whatever it is, that weekend at 11 o'clock. My application is pending with the Brooklyn Bridge Park, but I think we should be good to go. So they'll be advertising it or getting the word out to people on their mailing list.
Okay. I have a couple of questions of my own I wanted to ask. One is, this must have been one of the largest public works projects in the country at the time the bridge was built. Do you know how it was paid for?
Yes, and so initially, well, the bridge company was chartered by New York State. A bill was passed in, I think it was 1867, to allow the bridge company to build the bridge and to issue stock. And so, for instance, I mentioned William Kingsley, the superintendent. He was, I believe, the largest stockholder in the bridge. There's certainly an element of Boss Tweed in the bridge and him winding up with free stock from Kingsley and perhaps some payoffs also. So that McCullough gets much more into than I do in my discussion of the bridge. But it was the cities of Brooklyn and New York also were stockholders in the bridge.
And so there were fees charged, I guess, tolls for crossing.
Yes, the idea was John Roebling was very enthused that we would be able to pay off the cost of the bridge, originally estimated at $5 million, which of course was a huge project. And that's why Boss Tweed became a member of the board. He was interested in any such project. Ultimately cost $15 million to build. And so there was money to be spent and apparently money to be had on the construction.
And I also wanted to ask, at the beginning of the presentation, when you were showing some of the other Roebling bridges, it just struck me how gorgeous they are architecturally, in proportion and detail. So not just as engineering works. And I'm wondering, were the Roeblings fully responsible for those aspects of the design, or did they have architects working with them? Do you know?
No, I think that was all John Roebling.
Mm-hmm.
He had studied, I believe, architecture in Germany also, and had seen bridges in Germany while he was still there. But, you know, he is widely regarded as a genius, and I think very much was, as a pioneer of suspension bridges.
Okay. And we have a comment here saying that the diagonal tie wires are used to stabilize the structure and that they're becoming popular as part of the design of some arch bridges in recent times, known as network arch bridges.
Okay.
I think I've covered the questions and comments. So with that being that it's 7:20, let me just thank you again for an absolutely wonderful presentation. I hope everyone goes out and buys the book. I know I will.
I do also.
So thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you, Jeff. And good night, all.
All right. And thanks to the Victorian Society and to Jeremy. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.